I had porcelain and it just broke off on microphones. I tend to get uninhibited when I'm using a microphone. You know, when I'm all excited and 3 hours have gone by and I'm all whipped up in a frenzy, I'll kind of go crash, and I'll see a piece of white fly off through the strobe, and I'll go, oh shit, there goes another $600. Today was for nothing. You know, there goes the fee. I just wasted the fee again. So I tried gold and it worked. I'd go like crash and I'd break the microphone. And okay, there goes $50, much better, you know. So it's cost effective. My father was a drummer in dance bands, kind of Buddy Rich type dance bands in England before the war. So he was a drummer, so I grew up with drums around and actually remember playing on drum kits, being lifted on the stool and playing the rest of the drum kit, not the bass drum, when I was 3 years old. So my actual instrument of choice and the one I'm most skilled in is actually the drum kit. And I used to practice the drum kit 4 or 5 hours a day, all through the 60s. Wherever I lived, I'd have a room with a drum kit in it, and I would just play the drums constantly. I could do one-handed rolls and all that stuff. Yeah, I used to go and see them live and figure out how they did their little tricks. So I was always around the idea that music could be played by me, and it was very rhythmic, the side that I was introduced to. And also I was in the school choir. So I grew up in an English private school, public school, learning, medieval plain chant, Latin chant, reading all these complicated vocal scores and doing alto and descant. So I learned all those medieval and choral harmonies, and I could read music. And I actually sang in cathedrals and stuff, wearing those white robes with big collars. Well, the same school had this idea that when you were 14, art didn't exist as a real subject anymore. There was no art class after the age of 14. But I was fortunate. I was a stubborn, awkward, cantankerous and precocious little sod, and I insisted that didn't mean art didn't exist just because it wasn't in their curriculum. So to shut me up, they gave me a key to the art department, basically. And I had a free reign in my own time. Instead of having a lunch break or after school, I could go in the art department. And the two teachers were really nice, and they would show me how to do silk screen and show me all these things that they didn't teach the younger kids. They'd show me all the stuff that they were excited by when they were still at college. So I had basically two private tutors who were really just so glad to have one person really interested. And they wouldn't just talk to me about art. They'd tell me, you should read Ginsberg, and they'd bring one in, When the younger one had smoked pot and hash, and he was sort of encouraging me to check out the beatniks. And so I was lucky through a mixture of my own stubbornness and a perverse liberalism in this really straight school. They believed that they should always bring out the best in everyone, and even if it meant having a perverted faggot artist in the school, so be it. They should still make him the best he could be for the sake of Britain and the status quo. So they kind of it was a very peculiar and conflicting situation. But the books were where I got a lot of the art ideas. I worked in the school library, and I found books that mentioned Dada and surrealism. And that sounds more interesting. So I would just order books and read them, and I just lapped up Dada and surrealism, especially Dada. I just thought it was so great. Because it was philosophy, and it was sociology, and it was action on the street, and it was challenge, and it was mischievous, and it was reckless. People died, I thought that was pretty good. And they took drugs and did performances, and everything was fair game to become part of art, and everything that art was fair game to become part of life, and I never lost it. That's it. I still agree, Well, I read about Andy Warhol in the newspapers, and I still to this day have an old scrapbook with any press cuttings I could find about Andy Warhol and the factory. I would glue in, where everyone else was putting in pop stars, I was gluing in Andy Warhol. And staring at the pictures of the underground film stars and thinking, that looks cool too. I was voracious, but I was Very specific things excited me, and most of them were coming from outside what I was being naturally fed. But I could just feel a resonance straight away. Just that makes sense, that makes sense to me. Why that should be when I was living in a suburb, I don't know, but I just knew it made sense. Same with Burroughs, and when I read Burroughs and Guyson, it was the same thing. Okay, this makes complete sense. And I modelled my aspirations and my direction on feeling that view of life was correct and the other ones I was being given were incorrect. And then I read underground magazines. Oz magazine was coming out, International Times. I found a shop that had one copy every time it was issued, and I would buy it immediately and read all of that at home. And then I'd start to hitchhike to London to go to the Arts Laboratory, and I'd hitchhike to London to see experimental theatre plays. I saw The Exploding Galaxy, I went to Middle Earth and the UFO Club, I saw Syd Barrett play, And I guess I was just a very active seeker after anything that was stimulating. Oh, well, at school, it was sort of a mixture of desire and default. The school would say, oh, you do art, don't you? You're into all that art stuff, so will you design all the posters for all the events in the school? And I'd say, sure. So I started doing hand-painted posters for boring events. And then I did the first ever magazine cover for the school that wasn't just the school badge, the school symbol. I did a strange Greek god with big tits. Then they let it through. I got away with it. After 400 and something years, I changed the design of all the school graphics. And then I started my own magazine, and would get people to write things about what they didn't like about the school. And then I started doing events in the school that were the nearest I could get to an acid test without the acid.
And just when you finally got to drugs, was that a big...
Oh, I was already at drugs. Yeah, luckily the school just thought I was dabbling. I managed to do this triple bluff where I dabbled to the degree I could get away with, and then made it appear that I was just dabbling, so they didn't know that there were actually some real drugs going around too, And nobody knew much in England in the middle suburbs, the equivalent of Middle America in '65. No one really knew. They'd read a few scare stories that the Rolling Stones used pot. But they were still saying things like that, that hashish that people inject, and they still thought joss sticks were pot. So it was fun, because people were so ignorant. You could walk down the street smoking hash and talk to a policeman, and he had no idea. But if you had a joss stick, he'd take it away from you. It was a nice time. It was a really interesting kind of transient moment there. Yeah. So I guess I learned to exploit every little tiny doorway I could to my own ends. I mean, I was already doing hand-collaged letters and packages with objects in to friends that were still at school when I left school. I mean, it just was automatic to include pictures and objects and bits of newspapers, anything, just to make packages up and invent names for each other and invent characters that didn't exist and so on. That was already happening from '66. And then we'd go to thrift stores and buy books and then alter all the books and send each other these fabricated books, and then we'd do readings of the books onto tapes, and then we'd chop the tapes up and we'd send the tapes to each other. In fact, I started cutting up tapes when I was 11, before I even heard of cut-ups. I mean, I just got given a battery-operated reel-to-reel, and I was very bored with it very quickly, so then I would start to cut it up literally and make it feed back and try and get extra layers and so on. Just inevitably drawn to that. It was a relentless thing. By the time I was at university, I was in full flood. I was doing pamphlets, political pamphlets for the right-wing group, the Monday Club. Then the next week I'd write the Anarchist Club Reply. I'd write both the pamphlets, and I didn't actually tell them they were all employing me as the pamphleteer. So I'd draw cartoons attacking the one I did the week before, and then another one the next week attacking that, and then I'd write the whole article in the student newspaper saying this person should be thrown out of the university, and it was me, but I'd write under a false name. So I just tried to exacerbate every possible sore there was, for the sake of it, really, because I was bored. And of course, at university, I soon met the people who had drugs. Within 24 hours.
What were you studying there?
Sociology, psychology, and philosophy. It was suggested that I went to art college. And I said, okay, well, what would I learn at art college specifically? And they said, well, you'd learn actual skills, like you would learn how to make an etching, you would learn how to use oil paint. I said, okay, but if I really want to do that, I'll learn it anyway, right? Because I'll just do it, I'll find someone. They said, yes. I said, okay, and what else? Well, you'd learn art history. And I said, well, I'm reading that anyway, because I love to read about everything that's happening. So I decided to do something I wouldn't normally do, a discipline that I wouldn't normally choose, that would be more rigorous and more unpleasant. It was a mistake. I hated it. I was trying to be over-sophisticated, and it was a mistake. The fact was, the university was terribly tedious, terribly behind the times. The wave that I was aware of hadn't hit. Well, I got involved in all the causes at the university. There had been one sit-in already, and there was a very active small group of proto-yippie hippies. Mm-hmm. And we were all bonded because of the... No, it was just they were the ones who were dressed differently. At that point, it was still true. If they had on velvet trousers and long hair, they were probably your tribe, and they probably got beaten up too. And the other 3,500 people there still basically wore suits to go to lectures, and screamed abuse at you. So it was easy to find the rest, you know. They and then from that point they rented a big fruit warehouse, which became the collective spot. And I nicknamed it the Ho Ho Fun House, and we just all moved into this big fruit warehouse together. So it was easy. You know, there was either the fruit warehouse, the Ho Ho Fun House, or nothing. That was it. There was that. That was it. That was the centre of all the alternative activity. I started to experiment with political actions that were more art-like because of my reading of Dada and so on. I decided that it didn't just have to be shouting, you know, racist pig and whatever, you know. What? That there might be more imaginative ways to do it, like painting the whole university pink one night without anyone knowing, so that everyone just came into the university and it was pink. And you didn't explain why, you just thought, let's just screw with their perceptions, let's just make them wonder, why the hell is it pink today? You know? And we didn't like the vice-chancellor, the head of the university. He was a horrible conservative idiot. But instead of just complaining about him, which he was used to, we decided to form the Bryn Jones Preservation Society. And we printed these membership cards that were really pretty. And we loved him. And the whole point was that we loved him. And so when we went to demonstrate, we would demonstrate with big banners saying, we love Bryn Jones, he is better than a mother and a father. We would like to live in his house. You know, we would kiss his feet. We love him. He is the best man in the whole world. And all these politicians were coming to try and understand the unrest at the university. And they were confronted with people giving them leaflets saying how great the vice-chancellor was, but obviously very sarcastic. And it caused much more chaos. And then they sent the police in to drag us all away in front of the members of Parliament. And they were saying, no, stop, these people are being really positive, they're being really supportive, why are you beating them up, you know? And it actually created a lot more problems for the authorities, doing things that way around. So I started just playing with, you know, reversal of expectation, I guess.
Did you find the press?
And we got press interest.
On more too?
Yeah, yes, of course. It was very interesting to see how the media fell for bumper stickers. And that to have a couple of good basic phrases was just thought that they were lazy. That you could write the article for them if you just planned it right, and you could make sure you knew what they'd take a photo of. You know, so yeah, I learned a lot in a year. In a year there, we put a pig up to become the president of the union, but we decided to have everyone try and be president of the Students' Union as a joke. And what happened was we discovered that proportional representation does not work after a certain number of candidates. So the European Parliament came to interview us all because we discovered a flaw in the way that the Dutch Parliament was elected and so on, that we'd actually found out how to subvert European democracy by this art joke. And there was a big parliamentary and European parliamentary investigation, and I was like interrogated by all these big electoral experts on how had we managed to screw up the system so well, and we did end up with the office empty, and the seat in the office and a thing on the desk saying President of the Students' Union, and anyone who wanted to could go in there and sit there and answer the phone and say what they liked. We actually managed to do it. We had a conceptual president. Yeah, I started thinking of and using the word come towards the end of that year. I started having visions, in a nutshell, strangely enough, much to my own surprise.
Feel like going into that at all, or?
It was very odd. I went home to see my parents one weekend. I was kind of in transit to London. And they said, oh, why don't we go and see a castle or something like that? And, okay, and I sat in the back of the car, a bit bored, and started to drift, and was looking out of the window at the hedge going by and trying to have a drug experience because I didn't have anything with me. It's like, if I blur my eyes a bit. And I guess it's a bit like the Brian Geisen story of flicker. I got some kind of flicker effect of some type. Because all of a sudden I had an out-of-body experience and I was in the hedge and I was reduced to molecules so that I could travel through matter. And I was hearing voices. And I remember, this is really strange, but I like it. And it was very vivid, and there were all these ideas and proposals and strategies, and as soon as I didn't speak a word to my parents because I didn't want to forget what I'd experienced. And as soon as I got back, I ran upstairs and I just wrote it all down. I still got the notebooks. Wrote 100 pages of notes. And that was the real solidification of the Come project. So what? But I was already a member of the Exploding Galaxy at that point. That was where I was on the way to. What happened was, while I was in university and becoming more active, creating these kind of Dada political events, and also real acid tests. I was doing lots of happenings, I guess more in a happenings vein. The Exploding Galaxy came up from London, and they asked around, and they said, is there anyone here? We've just had a split in the ranks. We're short of people. Who might want to help? And everyone just said, oh, Genesis, he'll help. He'll do anything. So they came and found me. Huh?
They were a collective?
They grew out of David Medalla, who was a kinetic artist from the Philippines, who did bubble sculptures. And so they were from the kinetic art movement originally. But then they wanted to make kinetic art into a thing on the street, something bigger than just gallery art. Mm-hmm. So they set up a commune in Balls Pond Road, and they had poets and writers and filmmakers. Derek Jarman was part of it. That's how I met Derek. Tightrope walkers, art critics, beatniks, And they did street happenings. What? And they called them kinetic operas, but they were basically outdoor happenings. And they were the first people really doing that in London. And they got arrested a lot. And eventually the commune got busted. And they were all planted with drugs. It was actually a phony bust because they were seen as such a threat to the status quo. Well, I spent 6 months with what was the Exploding Galaxy and was renamed Transmedia Exploration. And I still use that word, of course.
And what kind of work were you guys doing at that time?
Very improvised, surreal happenings, I guess. But it was very rigorous. It was like a boot camp for deprogramming. You could not sleep in the same place 2 days running. There were no beds. The walls were knocked out so that if you were in the toilet, you were in the same room as everyone who was eating. If you were having a bath, you were in the same room as everybody. If you were trying to have sex, everyone was in one big space all the time, whatever process they were involved in. You never went to sleep at the same time every day. Every possible habit was broken. You couldn't eat the same thing you ate before. You couldn't have your hair the same the next day. All the clothes were in one box, male and female, and you just took whatever came out and wore. So you had to invent a character every day based on what you got from the box.
And that was for 6 months you were with them?
Yeah.
That's intense.
And it was really 24 hours a day.
Cultural food camp.
Absolutely. And I blessed the day I went there. It was so fantastic. And you had, everyone had the equal right. You'd be wandering around and somebody would say, why did you open that book and read it? And you go, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, you've read English before, haven't you? Yes. Well, then why are you reading it again? Why does it have to be a book? Why does it have to be that shape? Why does it have to be on paper? Why do the words have to use the same alphabet? And you'd have to come up with reasons, and if you couldn't, you'd have to find another way to have something that might or might not be read, but that could communicate an idea that wasn't just flat, square, round, whatever it might be. And once you'd invented it, everyone would say, well, didn't you do that yesterday? Or they would take it and run with it and change it again. So it was kinetic in that sense. It was hyperkinetic, and it was basically all about the destruction of every possible expectation and habit. It was very intense, and I've seen people become catatonic and have breakdowns while they were there. I mean, seriously, very quickly too.
So it was really reactive.
Yes, it was very tough, and most people couldn't take it. I loved it. I thrived. It was exactly what I hoped was going on somewhere.
So
to be permanently challenged and have everything destroyed and have nothing to hold on to was my dream. That didn't scare me at all. That was what I was aspiring to have nothing. And to wake up, to be able to wake up fresh, to be able to wake up and not just work based on an imposed inherited concept. One of the things that I still use is the deconstructed alphabet, where we were working on making a typewriter that changed the way it typed each time you used it. So we broke down the alphabet. We discovered if you use the English alphabet in capital letters, you could reduce it down to just lines, sloped lines, horizontal lines, and vertical lines, and curves. And that therefore you would only need a few keys that had the same curves for the S, the B, the same curves, and for an O and a P, all the same curves. All the B, the P, the Q is the same as the O. It's two semicircles. And E is 3 horizontals. A T has the top horizontal, an H has the middle horizontal, and L has the bottom horizontal. So there's very few things making up those capital letters, and you can join them and make words. But you can also make the words go any direction you want now, because they have to be linear, and you can drop away some based on whim and intuition as long. So it just became very free fall, and I was actually assigned to that was one of my main tasks, was the deconstruction of language. And I still use that way of writing on collages and sigils and graphics and paintings. To this day, I can't help it. I can write almost as fast that way as I can any other way. And I can read it years later. I can go back and I can repiece it together. And I actually invented 3 other versions of it too that are more difficult to read, where you take everything vertically and everything horizontally and drop one line. All the horizontals drop down a line, but they're still attached at the bottom, so it becomes like this. Strange Arabic-looking things. No drugs, no salt, no alcohol, no cigarettes, no meat. Very, very macrobiotic. The classic Animal Farm thing happened, of course, which was that the guy, Gerald Fitzgerald, who was in charge, became in charge, and was more of the guru figure for a lot of the people. And his girlfriend, or the girl who became his girlfriend from the people involved, suddenly decided it was okay for them to have a bed and be in the same bedroom all the time. And then one day she turned up and she had handmade Victorian boots, and I was kind of curious how she did that when none of us had money. Any money you got was put in a box too, and if you wanted to spend even 20 cents, you had to explain to everybody why. And they would all come up with other ways you could do it that didn't need the 20 cents. Like you could walk for 2 days, instead of getting the bus, etc., etc. So there was no way she could have done it within the parameters of the group. And of course she'd just taken money from the box and got boots, and she was protected because she was his girlfriend. He wouldn't actually confront the fact that this was inappropriate. And of course, me being a big mouth and a fanatic by nature, immediately started waging war on them both, and I became the champion of the ultra motive, I suddenly was the purist, who felt that they'd betrayed the idea, and I would just rant, I would do all this stuff back, you see. how come you're doing this? And in the end, she freaked out and chased me with a big pair of sewing scissors. She was really, she'd really lost it. She was genuinely violent, and I couldn't help but just giggle. Which made it worse, of course. I was just laughing and giggling and diving out of the way when she lunged for me. And eventually we made our way up to the top of this house, and a bit of me was working very well for a theatrical moment, because I remembered that someone was working on the outside of the house and there was all this scaffolding. She didn't remember this, and I just said, something like "fuck you" and jumped out of the window, and it was like the 5th floor, and she just immediately, I remember clearly seeing her face, aghast, that she must have driven me to my death. And I jumped out of the window grinning, and it blew her mind. And of course there was a plank outside, and I just jumped out and dropped down, and I was on this plank she couldn't see. Yeah. And then I just sort of sneaked all the way back down the scaffolding, and I was in the backyard, and she finally brought herself to look out of the window, thinking, oh no, and looked down, and I'm going, yeah, fuck you. I left the next day. It caused too much friction. Well, that was another reason I had friction with transmedia, was that it was all kinetic, but there was no sound. And I just said, well, if it's multimedia, it should include sound, which needs music. Music doesn't have to be linear and traditional, but sound of some kind is appropriate. And I did try and introduce some. I met members of the third year band, and I got them to help. They were an improvisational violin viola group with tablas and stuff. And I used to go around the corner and jam with them on my violin. And I did the best I could, but it was frustrating, and I was aware that just adding rhythm and sound could pull together an otherwise somewhat formless and frustrating happening, Purely as a theatrical dynamic it could. And that they just didn't get it. They had no sense of rhythm. God knows what it was like when they were in bed together. They had no sense of tuning at all. So I thought, well, it's non-sexual and it's hierarchical and it's got no music. I think that should definitely be involved. So I went off to do my new improved version, and even had a rubber stamp for postal mail art that said "New Improved Coon" for a while, But that doesn't take away from what I learned in terms of pulling potential from people and exploiting changing character and the dematerialization of identity and so on. Well, I after the Ho Ho Funhouse, I got frustrated with the yuppie side of the hippies. And so while they were all at the Isle of Wight festival with Bob Dylan, I moved in the Hells Angels chapter that was local for a big weekend party. I was the only one who wouldn't go to the festival. I had this fantastic, huge, long weekend with the Hells Angels that was really nuts. And of course they demolished everyone else's rooms because they were out of control. So everyone came back and their rooms were trashed. And I was responsible, and they held me responsible, and they all moved out, saying I was a terrible person, and I wasn't a real hippie, and how could I have met these people? Where did I meet such revolting people and low-class scum as the Hells Angels? So I held on to that building for a while, and it became the Hells Angels Clubhouse, and I was the caretaker for about 3 or 4 months, and then I found another big, old, rambling, derelict house around the corner that I took over. And I started what I guess was another psychotherapeutic art community there.
Called?
Well, that was the Coombe Transmissions. And I took the whole box thing further. I had a room called the Costume Room, and in that room were lots of costumes based on characters, like archetypal characters. The straight-laced housewife, Harriet Straight-Lace. And they were in an entire costume with accessories and everything and makeup and so on, and they were all organised to certain key characters. But then there were lots of other things you could also improvise with. And it was huge. It was as big as this space here. It's just this.
The drugs and music were part of this.
Yeah, they did return. They did indeed return, yes. LSD in particular did return with a vengeance, and I'm jolly glad too. So, so every weekend, people we'd met in the town, some of them were school kids and some of them were on the dole.
This is in Yorkshire.
Yeah. Somehow they'd see things happening in the street and come up and talk, and you could just feel which ones were interested and say, hey, come round, have a cup of tea, join in. And so it just became this sprawling, expanding street theatre happening to the world outside. That's what it was. But it was also deeper because, again, you could go in the costume room and you would emerge as Mr. Alien Brain, and you were an alien. And you had to talk as an alien and behave as an alien and be an alien all day. And go shopping as an alien and go and sign on the dole as an alien and be arrested as an alien, whatever. Or you would be Harriet Straight-Laced, the housewife, and you would be upset by everything, including everyone. It's terrible, it's terrible. And you'd have to get into character. So it was a series of characters, and you had to try and live the characters. And even have positions about life that you didn't agree with. And be convincing. And that was good.
Okay,
So we would basically, every room began to be decorated. Like if you walked inside, all baby prams were all along the roofs. It was very much like the descriptions I've read of Dada and Surrealist events where they would hang coal in sacks on the roof and so on. I was still influenced by that. So it was totally an alien environment, very baroque. And the whole building was an installation. And we were the characters in it, so it was a constant 24-hour surreal play happening. And there were speakers hidden everywhere in the ceilings and the walls and behind things, and microphones and so on, so that people in the street would hear people talking to them and wouldn't know where it was coming from. And when you came inside, there were loop tapes going. And we had friends who were professional burglars, and they would just keep bringing more and more tape recorders and microphones and amplifiers until the whole place was bugged. It was nuts. And of course it drew a lot of attention, unfortunately from the police too. But so one day this guy came up in a suit and said, I'm from the local arts centre, and I really like what you people are doing. I mean, and we said, well, that's nice, yeah, great. And he said, you should do something at the arts centre. And we said, yeah, right. And he said, we'll pay you. And we went, yeah, right. He said, you can get grants for doing this kind of thing. And we said, we can. And he said, yes, it's performance art. We said, it's what? He said, it's performance art. We said, okay, it's performance art. Where do we get the grant? And he said, come and do a thing, an evening. So we did the Alien Brain at the Hull Arts Centre, and it was a big success. The local newspapers lapped it all up because it was crazy. And then he gave us all these forms to fill in, and I filled them in and sent them off, and we got money. So we bought a big van, a big truck, and found somebody who could drive it, who we nicknamed the pilot, and gave him a whole pilot's outfit, World War I pilot's outfit. He was Lord Biggles. And we put a 4-poster bed in the back and rocking chairs, turned it into a living room, an old cottage in the back. So we were still in a theatre set wherever we went, even when we were in the back. And we just started to drive around in it, sometimes for fun at the weekend, and sometimes we'd be asked to go to arts festivals and get paid, and it just grew from that, really. Well, we were very good at scrudging. One of the transmedia words was scrudging, which is basically scrounging up stuff that's left, going through bins and skips, the classic
Dumpster
dumpster, yeah. We were good at doing that. We were good at talking to local people and making them decide we weren't so bad after all, and getting them to donate things. And sometimes we got given a ton of gas masks. They said, somebody went, do you want a ton of gas masks? And we said, yes, sure, okay. So we filled a room with gas masks, which was fun anyway, and then we started to spray them gold, because we got given gold spray paint by somebody else. So in the end we had a ton of gold gas masks. So we would just build environments. So basically we'd build an incredible environment with whatever materials we had at the time, and then we would be the characters in the environment, and we would improvise. And we would provoke people in the audience, and we would just make sounds. We'd wire the place up. So we'd recreate the house. Sometimes we'd take everything in a room in the house and move it there and rebuild the room somewhere, like the living room. So we'd all be sat in armchairs, and we'd just have cups of tea and talk like we did anyway. And they rented us for a day as we were at home. We built once we just built a minefield at this arts event in this park, and put loads and loads and loads and loads of barbed wire, like a First World War warfield, But it was real mines. We'd make these, they would explode with tripwires and everything. And we put up lots and lots of warnings and gave out leaflets. This is a real minefield. It's really dangerous. Don't go in. Don't touch anything. It will explode. And of course, the drunken 20-year-olds wanted to show off to their girlfriends, and they'd jump over the barbed wire and fall over and hit a tripwire, and there'd be a big explosion, and they'd just about piss their pants and start complaining about the fact there was a minefield in the arts festival. You know? So there was all kinds of stuff like that. But in 1973, the police ran us out of town.
Out of Yorkshire?
Yes. And I was up this ladder painting something on the outside, and they were holding the bottom of the ladder like this, moving it. And they were saying, you know, if you're still here next week, you'll be in jail too. You know, you're going to leave town and you're never going to come back. Are you? I was like, okay. And they were notorious for being really violent, those police. You know, people regularly died in the cells, so I thought, okay. So I put everything I could into the big truck and just drove off one night. London. I was already doing a lot of postal art and correspondence art. I was already corresponding with Burroughs. In fact, I'd already been down and hung out with him by 71. I got hold of File magazine somehow as well. And so I'd write to lots more people from File. And I was writing to Robin Klasnick and Jules Baker, and I would also meet them at some of these festivals. And they were all living in a licensed squat in a big factory in Hackney, in Martello Street. And so when they'd already said, why don't you just come to London, you know, why are you banging your head on a brick wall in this nutty town, you know, it's bound to get bad. And so I said, okay. So I drove down there, basically. And I said, is there anywhere in the factory that I could put my stuff? And there was one part of the basement that was rotten. There was no floor, there was no electricity, no water. Just a gutted piece of the basement of a factory. And I said, I'll have it. I drove around in the truck, and I went in derelict buildings and went to building sites where they're demolishing stuff, and just said, you know, I work for a children's project for challenged, physically handicapped children, and we're doing a theatre piece, and we really need floorboards. And scrounged enough stuff to put a floor in, and then found somebody who did electrics. You know, I don't know, just renovated it. Put in water, put in electricity, put in a floor, and moved in there. And Bruce Lacey was there, who did robotics, and Andrew Logan did the alternative Miss World events at this factory. Hermine, who was part of the Exploding Galaxy, the tightrope walker, she used to practice there. So I knew all the people, a lot of performance art people.
And at this point, Cozy?
Cozy was with me, and she came down with me, just her and me. Just the two of us. Everyone else was in jail. They really were. Except for one who was in a mental hospital. But everyone was, they were serious. They really were putting us all away one by one, you know.
But the work that you were doing at that point was already approaching something very confrontational, violent, sexual.
Yes, that was coming more and more. And once we shed everyone in whole and we were on our own, it just that was amplified really quickly. You know, when it was the male-female characters, the archetypes, it was inevitable that the sexual roles and the gender roles would become more intrinsic, I think.
And music was still part, or becoming more and more a part of what was going on?
Well, music actually was less a part for a little while. I mean, we used to use tape loops and collage tapes and found tapes as atmospherics, but it actually went back to something much more like... Well, basically what happened was I got involved with Fluxus as well. Through the mail art thing, I got to know people, and Ben would write to me, and David Mayer, who did Fluxus in England, used to write to me, and I can't remember all their names now. Dick Higgins, and I don't know who else. A lot of them wrote to me. And so I bought some of the books, I learned more, I liked it too, it made sense, same thing, you know. Some of that was definitely absorbed, I think. And I took part in the Fluxus exhibition that travelled around England sometime in the early 70s as well. Yeah, so in the Fluxus thing, one thing that really struck me was one of these small card, and one of those little statements of, and it was just that classic one. I think it was a Japanese one. I don't think it was Yoko though. And it was, take your clothes off, but take 24 hours, something like that. And that really hit me hard. That whole idea of slowing everything down. And basically, one of the really major shifts in how we performed and what we did in actions was slowing things down. And we discovered, Cozy and I, that we had this incredibly symbiotic way of working when we slowed down, that we became really like shadows. And my interest was in the man and the woman as archetypes, and us being both. That I could be the woman and she could be the man, and that we were shadow creatures of each other, and we weren't representing her and me or him and her, but we were actually one person. And if I could have been two bodies, that would have been even better, you know. What I wanted to explore was a hermaphroditic aspect of being, and what sort of resonance happened when you started to give full recognition, physical recognition to this whole other being inside you, and also what was in between, and what were all the gradations, and what were the dynamics when the society in the early 70s was confronted with that, and it was actually pro-sexual. And I guess some of that came from, all these things are synthetic. I was in the Gay-Live Street Theatre, so I'd already been with people who were transvestites as a political act, and even had a lover who was for a while. So it didn't come from nowhere. It all gets mulled over, and all these little things turn and interrelate and trigger each other. And I think, what I learned from the 6-month boot camp was how to be fluid and flexible, and how to let things through and not have any preconceptions in advance of what might be happening to me next. That my identity was never fixed, should never be fixed, and didn't even really belong to me. And so it was a really deep exploration, beyond habit, beyond just conditioning. It was into the DNA, if you like. Well, we started to do more and more performances, just myself and Cozy, that were very, very, very overtly sexually based. Dealing with taboos, dealing with transgressions, dealing with sexual programming. So they did include masturbation and making love and having mutual anal sex and having sex with strange objects, and all at really, really slowed down speed. And they got more and more aesthetic and graphic, both in terms of how they looked as well as what was the content. And we discovered, surprisingly, that serious galleries and art critics became more and more curious and supportive the more and more we pushed ourselves.
Wow.
Which we didn't expect at all. We didn't really have an expectation. We were pushing ourselves at home as well as in public. What we did in public was always just a bit of what we were doing anyway, And through doing things in the galleries, in the Museum of Modern Art in Paris and Brussels and all over, for a while, everything became completely silent, surprisingly. And we would take 8 hours to just cross a room, but during that crossing the room, all kinds of things would have happened that, if you freeze-frame them, were quite surprising or erotic or disturbing. Mm-hmm. And yet, all that had happened in terms of the script was we crossed the room and took no notice of each other. That might be the only directive we had, But on the way across, we would have used blood, urine, milk, all kinds of things would have gone on, and we would be transformed by the time we got to the other side. But you couldn't say when it happened. It was so slow that time was changed a lot. And that was very effective for a long time, making it more and more slow and silent. But then there was a point when we had complete control over what happened. We knew we could be convincing. We knew we could make it so gripping that people would remain silent. And we knew that we were getting a favorable response, which meant we didn't need to do it anymore. And I was becoming aware of my ears for whatever reason. I suddenly thought, the silence isn't working for me anymore. It's becoming pretentious instead of difficult. It's letting people away. It's letting them be away. It's letting them still drift and be asleep a bit. It keeps them safe because we're unreal. And I don't want to be unreal. I want to engage people. I want them to be jarred. I want them to have to think, what's happened? So I decided it was time to start to include sound again. So that people...
What year?
That would be 75. Because the factory was next to a railway and there were all these sawmills and welding places all round. And on a Friday there was a big black disco across the road and it came through the earth downstairs. And I think that was all feeding in, for sure. In fact, we even said so later with TG that the first album was just going outside the front door. Every noise was there. You just stood outside for an hour and you heard the album. All the pulsing sounds and the train rhythms. It was actually a photograph, really. Although we didn't do it that consciously. It kind of dawned on us halfway through. We're not doing anything. We're just making an oral yeah. So I think that was affecting it too. Well, in 75, Sleazy appeared as well.
Okay, and he was working with Hypnosis.
He was working with Hypnosis, doing all those surreal photograph record covers and so on.
Right.
And he was fascinated with Burroughs, and the only reason, really, apart from probably an innate curiosity at seeing us and thinking that we were doing something no one else was, that he knew of anyway, that he really spoke to me the first time was because he wanted to find out William Burroughs' address. Because he wanted to send him some of his photos of boys. And I said, sure, come round, come and visit. Show me the photos too. I'd love to see your pictures of young boys with injuries. Sounds really interesting, So he did come round, and we discovered that he was really interested in working with sounds and tapes and cut-up tapes, and had been. And I went, oh yeah, I do that too. So we had another common ground. And through those dialogues with Sleazy, really, I think the impetus towards reintegrating tape loop sounds, cut-ups, environmental sounds, which led towards TG, happened. I think that gave it a push. And also his interest in simulating injuries, so that we could have real injuries and phony injuries, and people would be aghast at the phony ones and not notice the real ones, and we could play with all these extra realities suddenly. Well, in 1975, I decided that we should move into the world of popular music.
What spurred that on?
I talked to William Burroughs. One of my conversations with William Burroughs, and we'd basically proved our point. People with no official art training and no art sponsorship or patronage at the beginning, and not in a gallery system, had become, certainly in Europe, accepted as important artists and on a par with Gilbert and George, who we often did things at the same events, and I got on well with Gilbert and George. So suddenly we were doing big retrospectives of modern contemporary British art. We'd done it. We were in catalogues. We were in art magazines. We were getting bursaries. We were paid per annum just to be performance artists, whatever we did. And something about that made me uncomfortable, because that wasn't really what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do was prove that you could deconstruct and reconstruct your character to be successful at anything, and that you could infiltrate all kinds of big target cultural institutions and actually do something unexpected and make it work.
And confront the status quo
Yeah.
at the same time.
So Burroughs basically said, well, that's all fine, and it's great, and he'd help me get grants, so he wasn't antagonistic to Kuhn, but he said, but if you went into the local pub in Hackney, would they understand what you were doing?
Wow.
And I said, I don't know. That's a good question. So I went away and I pondered on that. And I decided whatever we did should be able to potentially make as much sense to the people in a pub as the people in a posh art gallery in Milan. And it shouldn't need a book to explain why it was important. And it shouldn't necessarily alienate them in the way that we had. We knew that they wouldn't want to watch certain of the aspects of our sexuality that they would dismiss it rather than think. We wanted them to think. We didn't mind them being upset, but we wanted to maintain the interaction enough that thought was provoked in some way, constructive, self-analyzing thought. So we actually began. I'd already had the name Throbbing Gristle since we were in Hull. It was slang, so it was always going to
Slang for
an erect penis having an orgasm, I guess. And all the local prostitutes used to have sex against the wall opposite the house where we were, you see, so we'd turn off all the lights and take acid and watch them on a Friday night. That was one of our entertainments. And they'd use all these very colourful expressions, and lots of those got absorbed into the Throbbing Gristle project, including the name of the band. And I wanted it to have a name that was completely ugly and awkward and not like the name of somebody doing serious art-based music.
no.
I wanted everything to be contradictory and unexpected.
What was art-based music in London?
Well, I think it was, well, what we were doing was going to be art-based just because we were conceiving of it from Coombe. So we were looking at it and perceiving it and strategizing it very clearly. We worked out about having uniforms. We worked out about the graphics and what they would be like, the slogans, the attitudes, the press releases. We spent that whole year of 75. Every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we would meet and build equipment and then find out what that equipment could do and then rebuild it. We built all our own speakers. And it was during that year that we met Chris Carter. He was friends with Bruce Lacey's son, Bruce Lacey being the robotics person upstairs who was the caretaker of the building. And Bruce Lacey's son said, "Oh, I know a guy who can build things, called Chris." And so I said, "Well, bring him down, you know." So the next weekend down came Chris, and it turned out he built analog synths as a hobby, and built effects and built speakers and understood all that stuff, and was a studio engineer somewhere in a television company. So it was okay, you turned up at the right time, welcome to the band. And he and I would build stuff all week, you know, build bass bins and experiment with all kinds of speakers and horns.
And the sound developed.
Yeah, over all that time. Sleazy was really into tape loops, so he would start working how to build things that he could play lots of tapes simultaneously and mix them. He bought lots of bugging devices, and he used to bug boy prostitutes' rooms and things, and make tapes of boy prostitutes propositioning clients and use those. And so a lot of the stuff is authentic and illegal. He also bugged a mercenary office as well, where they recruited mercenaries for Rhodesia. That was very dangerous. We bugged them from a car outside. So one of the things we wanted to do was to bring in this whole truly, you know, investigative journalistic approach to music, sort of beyond John Cage, who says everything that's happening is potentially part of the music. We completely concurred and agreed with that, and wanted to apply, if you like, John Cage to what might be called popular music, or appear to be popular music, and build on that.
What did you want this music to do?
Well, basically, if you like, it's going to sound awfully naughty and probably politically incorrect, but it struck me that up to that point, from my point of view, including the Velvet Underground, really, that music was rhythm and blues, which was basically gospel music, which was basically slave music, i.e. music of slaves after they were brought here from Africa. So it was African-based music, and it was about a slave experience, and it was about an agricultural experience, cotton fields and so on. Right? So it was slavery to the agricultural world and the colonizing of the world, and I just felt it wasn't really actually relevant to me, and that it was actually pretentious and inappropriate of me to pretend that I was in any way truly empathetic with what that meant. That I should have my own music based on white adolescent angst, and also that it should be post-industrial. For fuck's sake, we've had the Industrial Revolution. What happened? Where's the cotton mills? I was in Manchester where the mills were. The cotton had already been picked. Where's the music for the mill? Where's the music for the factory? Where's the music for the truck taking the clothes to the big store? Where's the music for all of that experience, the urban Western experience, albeit exploiting that other experience? There wasn't one. There wasn't really a lineage.
And it wasn't.
And it seemed ridiculous, you know.
You didn't find it in electronic music.
I used to listen in the 60s as well as the Rolling Stones. I'd listen to Cage and Stockhausen. I'd buy those avant-garde albums and electronic music albums, and I liked it a lot. But I thought it was very cold and conceptual and non-emotional a lot of the time. I could enjoy the noises, I could enjoy the spaces and the newness of some of the sounds. But I felt that there was some way to synthesize that intellectual approach with the emotional, alienated, angry gut feeling of actually living in an urban shithouse, you know.
So Hackney.
Which was Hackney.
And what about...
You know, we should have our own language. That was it, basically. It was like, where's the bloody language for all of us? There isn't one. We should make one if we think it's missing. That was what it was. And what's it based on? It's based on machines and repetitions and drones and noises. And that's why I was always so cantankerous and would disagree so much with a lot of the punks who I knew that I liked them as people. And I understood what they were trying to do. And I said, well, for fuck's sake, it's playing rhythm and blues. What's that got to do with anything? You know, you live in London. You know, you've never got and worked on a farm. I actually have, but that's not the point. You know, I've picked potatoes, but, you know, right, if you're going to do... Why learn 3 chords, was it? You know, the old thing, you know, learn 3 chords, form a band. And I would say, why on earth learn 3 chords?
What did you think about the explosion of punk that time as opposed to what you were trying to do?
Well, it was careerist. They wanted a career, they wanted to be popular, they wanted groupies, they wanted to be in magazines. It was the same story as Cliff Richard and Elvis and everyone else, you know. Success and attention was more important than integrity. I wasn't interested. It was obvious. It was like such an obvious unfolding that was going to happen. It wasn't exciting for me. The only thing that was exciting was the occasional accidental unleashing of mindless violence.
So how did you guys collide with this world? And
John Craveen. You see, John Craveen, who was at university with me, lived in the Ho-Ho Funhouse and helped finance that. Drove an old London taxi with Smile, and that was the taxi that took us out to the country to take drugs. He let me live in his flat on the floor when I went back to do the coon thing more. I bumped into him in Portobello Road. I was walking along and he ran out of this lock-up shop and said, Genesis. And I went, John? And I said, what are you doing now? He said, oh, I have a clothing shop. I went, you've got what? And he said, yeah, come and see. It's on the King's Road. And at that time it was called Acme Attractions. So I went down to his shop one day and Don Letts was the guy behind the counter and they were selling mod suits mainly and sort of retro stuff. Nice, you know, nice original mod stuff. And I liked Don Letts immediately. You know, this young kid with dreadlocks in a shop selling mod clothes to white boys with money. I thought that was so great. And Don was already starting his punk movie. And I discovered there was this thing between Sex, which was Malcolm McLaren, and what became Boy, which was John Craveen. And John said, oh, I'm starting a punk band to sell the clothes in my shop like Malcolm's got his band. And I don't know anything about music. Will you audition everyone? That's how I got to meet them all. So I did. I auditioned people for his band, Chelsea. And I picked out Billy Idol, who was still Bill Broad, and Tony James, who went on to do Zig Zig Sputnik, and John Towie, who went on in lots of groups as a drummer, and Gene October was already in it. John Craveen had found Gene October, so I picked the others. And the Damned rehearsed in the place where the auditions were, so I met them. I liked Dave Vanian immediately. I thought he was funny. So I just met them, and then through them I met Mark Perry, who did Sniffing Glue, who was already formed a band with Alex Ferguson, who was alternative TV. And through them I met Sue Catwoman, who was Mark P's girlfriend, who was the Sex Pistols girl on the front of the first Anarchy in the UK magazine. And she ended up in the hospital ill, and he didn't bother to go and see her, so I went to see her, and she ended up being my lover, and she knew everyone. So she'd take me out, and she'd dress as a Marine, and I'd dress as a Marine. And I met everyone. She just knew everyone in every band. So I was just all of a sudden I knew them all, the Jam and everyone when they were just playing in little pubs.
Were you already working as Robin Grissom?
Yes, that's why Mark Perry was interested. He'd heard that we were doing a really much more extreme anti-music project, and he was really into it.
So, what were the first shows of
Well,
Robin Grissom like?
it got to 76, and before Prostitution, we got to the point where we'd learned how to make enough strange noises and make the equipment almost play itself and become a noise environment. And we would just touch things and hit things, guitars and that, and it would just change and pulse, and I would improvise stories and ideas and words over it. And I was asked to curate an exhibition at the Air Gallery in London. And so I was already into the idea that people who create interesting radical art, their psychological profile is probably the same as the interesting criminals. Not a new thought. Colin Wilson's written about it, but I'd taken it on board, and I thought it was an interesting way of looking at art, that they were all criminals, and that the best artists had to be the ones most like criminals, and the others were petty criminals. So I was kind of having a nice time, making different value judgments as to the value, what art was worthwhile or not, based on the antisocial attitudes of the creator rather than the product. And so I did this exhibition based on that. It was called High Crime is the Same as High Art. And several people that I picked to be in it wouldn't be in it because of the title. And there was a big stink because the poster was done like a newspaper thing, so it looked like it was a newspaper headline and that someone had done something bad, and it was really bland, the poster. It really upset everyone in the art world. And they'd originally said they wanted Coombe to do something too, so we said, okay, we're doing a project called Throbbing Gristle. They didn't know what that was. And we set up all our stuff in the back room, which had big, thick concrete walls, locked the doors, and then played for an hour with the doors locked so no one could come in. So they could only hear it through the wall, through the concrete wall. Because we were still in a real purist phase of it being industrial and it being the building as well. And that was the very first public one. And then we'd been booked to do an outdoor festival, Winchester, a town called Winchester. And we rang them up and said, we don't do Coombe anymore, we actually do Throbbing Gristle now, but we'd do that for you if you want. So they rented a hall somewhere, and we did one there too. So we did two kind of tryout TG things before the ICA. And then the ICA was a retrospective of Coombe Transmissions, but it was also the unveiling, the spectacle unveiling of Throbbing Gristle, and saying, that's the past, this is what we're doing now.
How that manifests.
It was great. It was October 76, forgive me. And the opening night, I said, I don't want it to be like the usual opening night at a big gallery. I want it to be more like a working men's club in Yorkshire, where you have beer. You don't have wine and stuff. You have beer in big beer glasses. And instead of art critics, we have a comedian telling dirty stories. Cabaret act, and strippers. Let's make it like a really cheesy northern club, like the Dockers go to, because we lived next door to one of these places for years. Every weekend we'd hear them all singing and getting drunk. That's when they'd go off with the prostitutes, you see. And as it was all based in that, rooted in that experience, that came in too. Okay, it comes from all of this working class culture in Yorkshire. So we brought down this guy from Yorkshire who told filthy jokes. And we had two striptease dancers and all the... Somebody told me about, and I think it might have been Derek Jarman, told me about these people who were transvestite security guards. And they were all over 6'2". So we hired them as the security. So we had all these really, really tall transvestites as the security for the whole gallery. And a bar selling...
Danny Mond must have flipped.
And of course, because of John Craveen and Sue Catwoman and everyone, all the punks, proto-punks who hadn't really been seen yet, although they were around. They hadn't hit the mass media at that point. They all came too.
This must have been very arty for them.
Well, they liked Throbbing Gristle, although they thought Throbbing Gristle were far too gratuitous and violent. You know, they thought we were well out of control, and it turned out afterwards that Sue Catwoman came, Susie and the Banshees as would-be, though they weren't yet, they came, and they said later that they were warned that I was supposedly going to hang myself with cheese wire during the performance, and that's why they stayed further back. So there were all these rumours going around amongst the punks because they thought we were completely nutty. They thought we were really insane.
What sort of things did you
And we didn't play real music. That was the other thing they hated about it. So it was the very first time that Britain and London saw all of those emerging dynamics and movements simultaneously, all in one night.
What stuff were you doing on stage? I mean, at that time, people thought would be violent.
Well, we were still including some of the performance things. So, like Chris Carter would be playing a synth, but gradually wrapping barbed wire around his arms so that the arms would sort of start bleeding, and in the end his synth would all get covered in blood. But he'd be expressionless while he did it, you know. And Cozy would have a leather jacket on, but nothing underneath, and she had simulated wounds, so it looked like she had great big gashes in her breasts and her stomach, and then I would drink milk and urine and blood in advance so that I could vomit blood and urine over people whenever I wanted to. Which all sounds corny now, but really no one else was doing. Even the punk bands who were just starting hadn't even come up with being that obnoxious.
You were puking.
I puked over Susie. Ruined her clothes. She's never forgotten, although she's forgiven. She laughs about it now. And I mean, just the way we approached the instruments was that they were just things that made noises, and we had no respect for them at all. You know, I was just as likely to play my bass with my boot as I was with my fingers, and I wore leather gloves so that it was really unsophisticated. And then we had all these effects which no one else was using, like loads and loads of space echoes and tape echoes and things that didn't have names because Chris made them, and everything was being processed through more and more levels of sound, and the voices were, and it was just this incredibly... And also we built our own PA. And to this day people tell me they've never heard anything as loud as TG, and it wasn't, it was actually measurably loud. It was just there was no middle. We just had incredible bass and incredible top, and we took out the middle. And it was therefore it was incredibly physical, which made people think it was loud. And when we didn't move, you know, we didn't do anything we moved to each other, and we'd talk to each other while we were playing. You know, I'd say to Chris, why don't you try doing this, and why don't you do that? And it was very much like, fuck you, the audience, you know. Oh, a guitar, it was partly just a joke to use a guitar. And to mangle the revered position it had reached with rock and roll, and to show a guitar does not have to have any relationship with rock and roll at all. It's simply something that makes noises that can be processed, and that's all it is. That's all any instrument is. You know, everything else is something that people add to afterwards for vested interests. You know, for status, for self-esteem, in order to give themselves a social job by being good at something, you know. And to this day, I have no respect for that. You know, I look around and I think, okay, I see an awful lot of terribly stupid, obnoxious, pathetic people who can play guitar. It can't be that special. Sorry.
And what
you
did
know,
what did they synthesize?
There's nothing special about that if all these morons can do it. You know, I'm sorry. I'm not impressed. So you can do it fast. You know, so a dog can run fast and another dog doesn't, and it's, you know, like with DJs now. I say, well, so what's the big deal? You can make 2 bits of plastic go at the same speed. I'm not impressed. You know, so what? You know, why do we all have to worship you because you can't just get 2 machines that run at the same speed? Why do you have to be there? Forget it. I'm not interested. You know, you're trying to tell me that we need a DJ? Yeah.
What about appropriation generally?
Well, at that time we were basically using all these we were using surveillance tapes and espionage techniques. We were really interested in that paramilitary, covert way of working. And then using those tapes in a Barrosian way, which with trouble tapes, sex tapes.
Tapes?
Yeah, one of the things I read about in The Third Mind and some of the other little essays that Burroughs and Geisin wrote about their experiments with tape recordings, which luckily I could check because I was friends with them, was this idea of, he tried it at the Chicago riots, Burroughs, walking around with a simple condenser mic tape recorder and recording the sounds of what's going on, going away, cutting in trouble tapes, which is police sirens, guns, people screaming, anything to do with panic and trouble, cops shouting stop, anything like that. You cut those in to the environment, which is the sound you've recorded, the standard environment. You go back, you walk around again, but you're playing the trouble tapes cut in. And his contention was that it's a magical ritual, and what you will do is you will manifest the trouble.
And he tried that?
Oh, he's done that lots, and Geisin too, and in fact he even claims to have closed down a restaurant that gave him bad food by doing that. In London.
And magic and ritual become part of the goings-on of...
Well, I was interested in it in a kind of empirical research way. I wanted to check out whether it happened, and if it happened, when it happened, and if we could repeat it if it happened. So it was scientific at the beginning, although I was aware it was a magical act. As time progressed, that was when I switched into psychic TV and started to look at it as purely a magical thing, assembling sound and music.
Let's go back.
But I was just giving you an aside there to give you an idea of why we would choose those kinds of sounds. There were no samplers. Trouble tapes, erotic tapes were the favourites, and things to do with autopsies and death. Basic human archetypal fears and shame and guilt trips were what we were interested in. War, murder, war, sex, drugs. Not so many drugs actually, but and trouble. We were anarchists. It was an anarchist project. We wanted to subvert and degrade and devalue all the sacred aspects of popular music, the history of music, the history of rock and roll. We had no respect for it. We didn't think it deserved respect. We thought it should be flushed down the toilet with a lot of other art and music. And if we could accelerate that process and reveal the vacuousness and reveal the contradictions and reveal other ways of approaching the dynamic of someone making sound, someone being theoretically an audience.
Was it a revolutionary act?
I don't care.
I mean,
I'm a hedonist. I don't care if it's revolutionary.
I mean, do you feel like...
I'm a nihilist and a hedonist and a sensualist. As to being a revolutionary, that's society's business.
But do you think that it's possible for music to disrupt or destroy a class system, for example?
No, I wish it did. No, I mean, if that was true, Bob Dylan would have changed everything. No, that was one of the things that we also were trying to say was, music never changed anything. Don't start going, I wrote a punk song against the Queen, so everything will be better in 10 years. Bollocks, It's not that way. But it can be one part of learning the way that control happens. The nature of it, revealing the nature of the beast, know thine enemy, see where the enemy is, isolate it, take away all the trappings that are there to persuade people it's not really so oppressive. Isolate authority, isolate control, isolate the system they use to maintain people's stupidity and sleepiness, and reveal it, and then despise it vocally, and describe it, and subvert it, and challenge it, and confront it, and stare into its eyes, and then turn away and do something else, because it's assimilated at that point. It's always going to be a small doorway, and you always have to close the door, either by going through or walking away, but, don't stay in the doorway for 20 years, repeating yourself, doing the same formula. Then you'd find artists again, like Bridget Riley doing Stripes. Of course, if you do Stripes for long enough, someone will go, that's the woman who does Stripes. And of course, in the end, if you're, tedious enough about it, you'll end up in a museum as the Stripe person, and you'll have two paintings in 6 museums forever. So what? Do we want to spend a lifetime proving that repeating a tedious act will eventually get attention? No. So you change. When are people... Timothy Leary used to bemoan this, and I bemoan it. When are they going to understand? Change means change. It doesn't mean copy each other and do the same thing until somebody gives you money. It means change. Change whether it destroys what you did before or not. Change whether you can pay the rent or not. Change whether you're going insane or not. Change whether you don't know what the hell you're doing it for anymore or not. Just keep changing. Destroy everything that went before and keep changing. And when you become habituated, be scared and change again.
Did hearing music...
Or stop, one or the other, but don't batter everyone with it just because you want them to give you recognition. And it's true to say, I think, that the idea of repetition intrigued us, having been so formless and very semi-classical. I listened to 75, 76 TG, and it's very classically based. The structures are very symphonic, and it floats right off into space, because I always wanted to have no drummer, and I didn't really want to have a drum machine. And I think one of the things that created the final demise of TG was giving too much credence to the drum machine. It makes things easier. Yeah. And of course, for a while there were some rhythms we used which were bits of tape cut up, so they created a rhythm, and it was people's voices, and it was interesting. And some of the rhythms we had at the beginning on DOA were definitely atypical rhythms, and I would work with vocals on them in a non-typical way.
Very startling record.
And I think DOA was a real classic in terms of rhythms that weren't rooted in blues and jazz and disco and so on. We ended up where each of us had a harmonizer, each of us had a gristleizer, each of us had an echo, and then there was one just for vocals of all of those machines as well. But also, Chris and Sleazy found these headphones with the little microphones that were actually from a surveillance shop before you could buy them. Now they're everywhere, but this was before you could buy them except through spy espionage shops. And they converted them with switches, so on stage they could all talk to each other through them without the audience hearing, and then they could flick a switch and anything they said would come out of the PA as well. And we became very interested in miniaturization until we just reduced our equipment down to one flight case each, and inside that was a miniature everything. And so we just had to plug one wire into the mains and the instrument into the box, and we were set up. We didn't need a sound check. It took us 2 minutes to set up on stage. We just took the lid off. The lid had all the effects in it. Dropped the lid to the floor. You plugged into the mains. You plugged into the box. And that was it. And so we had one box each. And they were this big. They weren't big. And they had a little tiny Roland speaker with a little tiny speaker in it. That's all we needed to hear what we were doing. And then just one wire went from Chris to the main mixer. With his mix, he mixed everything. So each yeah. And we'd have another PA, so they would always hire their own PA, so we'd put their PA at the back of the room. So that normally we felt people would move away to a point where they could control what was happening to them. As they moved away, it got louder, because it was behind. So there was this whole maintaining control over... We insisted on absolute control over how much we abused the audience. It was very important to us that we had, if we decided we wanted to find out what happened to them when we did this to them, we didn't want them to have a way to stop us finding out.
And what was going to a TG show at that time like? What was it like for the audience? What they experienced?
Well, all I know is that people were at them still remember them vividly and I think fondly. And also as almost like a sensory deprivation experience, or as some kind of challenge that they had to go through, physical, emotional, mental challenge that they had to survive.
And what were your motives?
Same, the same. Find out what happens when you push yourself over the edge. Find out what's unknown, see what happens to us. I mean, we always experimented on ourselves too. The Death Factory, in the old factory, we'd put everything on as loud as we could, and we would stand in front of the speakers for 2 or 3 hours and see what happened to us, whether we felt sick, whether we fell over. And sometimes we were very affected, we got tunnel vision. Chris went temporarily blind from the frequencies. Everything was moving and shaking, and our clothes were flapping just from the air moving so much from the sound. I mean, at one point with my bass guitar, I had such big speakers and so many amplifiers that if I touched the string just like this, all my clothes moved. And I would have them I would actually have like a reflex bin that I could climb in as my monitor. And then on top of that were 4x12s as monitoring. And piezo horns. All this was just the monitoring for my bass next to me, and I was stood next to it. So I would touch the bass, and my whole body would feel, on a non-audio level, what I was doing. It was so deep that it was like I was playing my metabolism. It was really nice. It was very strange. Well, we did, I guess the staging is the first thing to think of. We did one at the Architectural Association where we were asked to, I guess we were asked to play at the end of term party or something. I'm not quite sure now, but we ended up there. And I went in advance and looked at the building because it was actually, TG was often site specific. That's why I think it had an art slant too. And I noticed there was a courtyard, and the courtyard had 5 walls, and you could only get into the courtyard from one door in the basement. But it went up several floors. There were all these windows in all the walls, and then on the roof you could go up and look down from the roof too. So I said, we want to play in the yard. I went away and I thought about it more, and I actually had a dream where I dreamt what we should do, and we built a scaffolding box in the middle of the yard with a floor, and we put all of our speakers around the edge of the box, so the rest of the yard was just all our speakers facing straight up. And we covered the scaffolding box in polythene and tarpaulin and so on. And we set up inside with video surveillance cameras inside, black and white ones, one for each person. And then when we played, we locked the door. So there was no audience actually able to get to what was theoretically the stage. And we had TV monitors in the building, in all the corridors and the ordinary rooms where we would normally play, with no sound, no audio feed. So you could either watch us and not hear anything, or you could go and hang out of a window or stand on the roof and hear it, but not see anything. There was a riot. There was a really violent riot. People started smashing down the door. They pulled toilets out of toilet closets and threw entire toilets down. Luckily, we built it well, and it just these things just bounced off the top of this box and flew off. And we did another one at the film co-op where we just had the film screen in front of us, and we showed our movie and played live to the movie, but no one could see us. And there was another violent reaction. Members of the Slits started throwing chairs, screaming that it was unfair they couldn't see us, that it was sexist because they couldn't see us. And we did the classic. We found scrunching. We found all these big mylar mirrors from some shop displays. So another time we just had a huge mirror in front of us, so all they could see was themselves. And we shone halogen lamps on them too, so they could see themselves really well. Some of it was just pure perversity and just spite, to be honest. Sometimes it was just spite, or it was just triggered by finding the mirrors, It wasn't necessarily, this is symbolic of this. It was more, fuck them, let's stick mirrors up, then we don't have to worry about them. It's kind of more we just didn't like the audience. We didn't like to have to deal with them. We didn't really particularly care what they thought. They were our guinea pigs.
Were you familiar?
We were very callous. It was very callous. We didn't care. We didn't care if they vomited. We didn't care if they tried to leave the room. We didn't care if it was uncomfortable, and we didn't care if they loved it, Of course, the art world considers all popular music to be a bastard form of culture and a demeaning activity. Oh, well, then you're not art anymore, and your art can't really have been serious and good because you've stopped being formularized and stylized, and you're dealing with plebs,
Were you familiar at all with
dealing with ordinary people, and they don't have to have a special language to comprehend the fact it's loud. Or you're saying fuck you. It's not elitist in the same way, and the art world loves to be elitist, whatever it might tell you. It thrives on it. In fact, it's deceptual art rather than conceptual art at this stage, as Brian Gysin would say. It's become the history of deceptual art.
And so, pop.
And we didn't want to be part of the deceptual art world. We really wanted to be in a more visceral, gratuitous, and meaningless form of culture. We liked that. It was relaxing for us. I have to say I'm very proud of the longevity of the Throbbing Gristle project. I'm surprised, but the more I consider it now that I'm not emotionally attached to it, for a long time I was equally as anti that as I was anti-art before, and so on. I have to be, to move. I have to reject completely what I did before. It's essential for my way of working, but now I don't care. Now I can look at it as if it was someone else, and it's historical, and it's as if someone else did it. I have to recall for you what I felt. I have to try and almost do a hypnotic regression, because that's not how I feel now necessarily. But why? I think that we hit a hot spot, both in terms of ourselves and our perception, our stubbornness, our motivation, and clarity of intent was hot. I think we just really stripped away an incredible amount of bullshit. I think we did create a huge dialogue of which we only dealt with a part, which meant other people could take it. We opened a genre, if you like, to a degree, half-wittingly and half-unwittingly, and other people could take and run with certain aspects of that, or come in with their aspects that made sense within that, or parallel to that. So I think we both stimulated other people to do things, and that's always good. If you like, it almost worked as a flagship for a movement, a loose movement. It spoke very loudly and symbolically and graphically about an attitude that a lot of people felt. That has to happen. You have to have a commonality of attitude. It's what I call relentless inevitability. What we did was inevitable. It wasn't because of any innate genius in ourselves, or perceptual cleverness, or unique talent as such. The most we had that maybe someone else didn't initially have at that moment in that place was stubbornness, and nothing better to do, you know. We saw what was obvious to us. We did it. We did it wholeheartedly and without holding back, without reservation. And that gave it its power, its recklessness, and its total, our total immersion in it at the time. And I think, you know, it has to resonate with other people. They have to recognize themselves in what you express you are feeling. They have to go, yes, I am urban too, yes. I am sick of rock and roll too, yes. I like noise for its own sake. I see cars, you know, it's familiar, even though it's a condensed, crystalline form of the familiar. And so really it's good fortune and strong willpower to not back off doing the inevitable. And it has to be relentless, and it has to be amoral. And commercial considerations always destroy it. Always. With the best will in the world, as soon as you start to realize that you can pay the rent easier, you're lost. That's why I stopped TG. I knew that. I said it at the beginning, and I knew when it was happening to us that we'd become successful, and there was therefore absolutely no reason to continue. In fact, to continue would be to be the worst kind of hypocrite. And I think that's another reason it's lasted, was we let go. We had the courage to let go and get out of there, you know, and just let it be mythical or not, you know. I think it was a good move. Letting go was probably the best move of all. But we did nothing else. We lived and breathed and died it 24 hours a day, and risked everything for it. And I'm staggered how much energy we must have put into doing all that stuff. You know, just the sheer physical, mental energy involved. We were possessed, if you like. Maybe that's part of the whole process, to be possessed. And all the other disciplines about never returning to the previous character and always breaking habits, those are really all tools to maintain the space in the greater person and the greater intellectual activity of any individual, so that you can be possessed. Everything I've done that I'm proud of is in a moment of trance, if you like, in a moment of being possessed. It's not me per se, it's something coming through me, it's mediumistic. And those are always the evenings that are the best ones, the performances that are the best ones. They're always when time stops, you know. Time changes, it's elastic, where you go, wow, is that really 2 hours? We've all had that feeling. Those are the ones when you know it's hot.
We just had it now.
Okay, well, you see what I mean. That's really what gives it its weight. The rest is up to everyone else. But I think there was a true purity of intent for a while. I really think there was. We were fanatical. We had no doubts whatsoever that what we were doing made sense. Even when only 20 people came, or everyone wrote about it saying they hated it at the beginning, we still had no doubt whatsoever it was a good move and that it made sense. And I think that stays with something.